What happens when a country music star who's turned his life around from addiction and prison sits across from a talk show host who thinks she knows better than everyone else? What you're about to witness is one of the most explosive confrontations ever captured on daytime television. Jelly Roll, the tattooed giant with a heart of gold, walked into The View expecting a normal interview about his music and his incredible journey from the streets to stardom. Instead, he found himself face to face with Joy Behar, who decided to tear him down piece by piece on live television. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is a masterclass in how one person's arrogance can push someone too far. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you subscribe to the channel and drop a comment below with your thoughts, because trust me, you're going to have plenty to say after you see what unfolds. The studio lights were blazing hot that Tuesday morning as Jelly Roll adjusted his black button-down shirt and settled into the iconic View chair. The audience was buzzing with excitement, many of them fans who had followed his remarkable transformation from troubled past to chart-topping success. Whoopi Goldberg had just finished the opening segment, and the energy in the studio felt positive, almost electric. Jelly Roll, whose real name is Jason DeFord, had been looking forward to this interview for weeks. It was a chance to talk about his new album, his advocacy work for criminal justice reform, and maybe inspire some people who were struggling with their own demons. Our next guest has had quite the journey. Whoopi began with her trademark warm smile. From spending time behind bars to topping the country charts, please welcome Jelly Roll. The audience erupted in applause as Jelly Roll waved, his genuine smile lighting up the studio. He had that natural charisma that made people instantly like him, the kind of authenticity that you can't fake. "Thank you so much for having me," Jelly Roll said, his deep voice carrying that distinctive southern drawl that had become so recognizable to his millions of fans. "I've been watching this show for years, so this is pretty surreal for me." Sarah Haynes jumped in first with some softball questions about his music, his collaboration with other artists, and his upcoming tour. Jelly Roll answered with the kind of humility and gratitude that had endeared him to fans across the country. He talked about how music had saved his life, how his daughter had motivated him to change, and how he wanted to use his platform to help others who were struggling. "You know," he said, leaning forward slightly, "I think a lot of people look at someone like me, and they write me off before they even get to know my story. The tattoos, the past, all of that. But I want people to understand that we all have the capacity to change, to grow, to become better than we were." The audience was hanging on every word. This was the Jelly Roll that his fans loved. The vulnerable, honest man who wasn't afraid to admit his mistakes and talk about how he'd overcome them. Alyssa Farah Griffin asked him about his criminal justice reform work, and his eyes lit up as he described the programs he was supporting to help former inmates reintegrate into society. "I've been where these guys are," he explained, his voice getting more passionate. "I know what it's like to feel like society has given up on you, like you're never going to be anything more than your worst mistake. But that's not true. People can change. They just need someone to believe in them and give them a real chance." It was at that moment that Joy Behar, who had been sitting quietly with a barely concealed smirk on her face, decided to pounce. She had that look in her eyes that regular viewers of The View knew all too well. The look that said she was about to say something controversial just for the sake of stirring up drama. "Well, that's all very nice and inspirational," Joy said, her voice dripping with condescension. "But let's be real here. You spent years breaking the law. You were involved with drugs. You were in and out of prison. Now you're sitting here talking about second chances like you're some kind of expert on rehabilitation." The studio fell silent. You could literally feel the energy shift as Joy's words hung in the air. Jelly Roll's smile faded slightly, but he maintained his composure, clearly trying to take the high road. "I think my experience gives me a unique perspective," he replied calmly. "I'm not claiming to be an expert on anything except my own journey. But if sharing my story can help even one person avoid the mistakes I made, then it's worth it." Joy wasn't done, though. She leaned back in her chair with that self-satisfied expression she wore whenever she thought She was making a particularly clever point. But don't you think it's a little convenient that now that you're famous and making money, suddenly you're this reformed character? I mean, how do we know this isn't just good PR? The camera caught Jelly Roll's jaw tighten slightly. His hands, which had been relaxed in his lap, clenched into fists for just a moment, before he forced himself to relax them. The other hosts looked uncomfortable, clearly not expecting the interview to take this hostile turn. "Joy," he said, and there was a warning note in his voice that anyone who knew him would recognize. "I think you're misunderstanding what this is about. This isn't PR. This is my life. These aren't talking points. These are real experiences that shaped who I am." But Joy was just getting started. She had that predatory gleam in her eyes that meant she smelled blood in the water and was going in for the kill. "I'm just saying, it's easy to talk about redemption and second chances when you're sitting pretty with a record deal and sold-out concerts. What about the people you hurt along the way? What about the communities that were damaged by the drug trade you were part of?" The accusation hung heavy in the air like a dark cloud. Jelly Roll's transformation from composed guest to something much more intense was visible to everyone in the studio. His breathing had changed, his posture had shifted, and there was a fire building in his eyes that suggested Joy had just crossed a line she shouldn't have crossed. "You want to talk about the people I hurt?" Jelly Roll said, his voice getting louder, more intense. "Let's talk about them. Let's talk about how I've spent every day since I got clean, trying to make amends, trying to do better, trying to use whatever platform I have to help people." Joy, either oblivious to the danger she was walking into, or simply not caring, pressed on with her attack. But that doesn't undo the damage, does it? That doesn't bring back the lives that were lost to overdoses, the families that were destroyed. You can't just sing your way out of that responsibility. That was it. That was the moment when something snapped inside Jelly Roll, when the careful composure he'd been maintaining finally cracked under the weight of Joy's relentless assault. The man who had spent years learning to control his temper, who had worked so hard to become a better person, suddenly found himself face to face with someone who seemed determined to tear down everything he'd built. The explosion was instantaneous and volcanic. Jelly Roll shot up from his chair so fast that it actually rolled backward, his 6-foot frame towering over the desk as his voice boomed across the studio with a force that made everyone jump. "Are you kidding me right now?" he roared, his southern accent getting thicker as his emotions took over. "You think I don't carry that weight every single day? You think I don't know exactly what I've done and who I've hurt? Lady, you have absolutely no idea what you're talking about." The audience gasped audibly. Camera operators scrambled to capture every angle of the confrontation, while producers in the control room frantically debated whether to cut to commercial. Whoopi looked stunned. Sarah covered her mouth in shock, and Alyssa sat frozen in her chair. But Joy, incredibly, seemed almost pleased with herself, like she'd successfully provoked exactly the reaction she was looking for. "There it is," Joy said with a smug smile, gesturing toward Jelly Roll as if his anger proved her point. "There's the real you, underneath all that redemption talk. Still the same angry criminal, just with better clothes." If the studio had been silent before, it was absolutely dead now. The only sound was Jelly Roll's heavy breathing as he stared down at Joy with an expression that was part fury, part disbelief, and part something much more dangerous. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a low, menacing growl that somehow seemed more terrifying than his shouting had been. "You want to see the real me?" he said, leaning forward with his hands planted firmly on the desk. "The real me spent 3 years in county jail thinking about every person I hurt, every family I damaged, every life I helped destroy. The real me has nightmares about kids who overdosed on drugs I sold. The real me goes to funerals of people I grew up with who didn't make it out like I did." Joy tried to interrupt, but Jelly Roll's voice cut through her attempt like a knife through paper. "No, you wanted this conversation, so we're going to have it. You sit up there in your ivory tower passing judgment on people like me, but what have you ever sacrificed? What have you ever overcome? You think redemption is some kind of marketing scheme, because you've never needed it yourself. The camera zoomed in on Joy's face, and for the first time since the confrontation began, she looked genuinely uncomfortable. Her smug expression was starting to crack around the edges as she realized that maybe she'd bitten off more than she could chew. "I'm just asking the hard questions that need to be asked," she said, but her voice lacked the confidence it had carried just moments before. "Someone has to hold people accountable." "Accountable?" Jelly Roll laughed, but there was no humor in it whatsoever. "You think you're holding me accountable? I hold myself accountable every single day. I work with organizations that help addicts get clean. I visit prisons to talk to kids who are making the same mistakes I made. I donate money to families who lost loved ones to overdoses. What exactly are you doing to make the world better, besides sitting here tearing people down?" Whoopi finally found her voice and tried to regain control of the situation. But Jelly Roll wasn't finished, and his attention was laser-focused on Joy. "You know what the difference is between me and you? I admit when I'm wrong. I own my mistakes. You sit here every day pretending like you're morally superior to everyone else, but you're just a bully with a microphone." Joy's face was turning red now, and not from embarrassment. "How dare you call me a bully? I'm a journalist asking legitimate questions about what?" Jelly Roll cut her off again, his voice rising back to a roar. "About how someone who made mistakes can't possibly have changed? About how anyone with a criminal past should just shut up and disappear? You're not asking questions. You're pushing an agenda. And that agenda is making people feel bad about themselves, so you can feel better about yourself." The other hosts were looking back and forth between them like spectators at a tennis match, clearly unsure whether to intervene or let it play out. The audience was completely silent now, transfixed by the raw emotion and intensity of what they were witnessing. "I've interviewed thousands of people," Joy shot back, her own voice getting louder and more defensive. "I know how to separate genuine rehabilitation from convenient storytelling, and what I see here is someone who's learned to say the right words to make people forget what they really are." That last comment hit Jelly Roll like a physical blow. His face went through a series of expressions, from hurt to anger to something that looked almost like pity. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter but somehow more powerful than it had been when he was shouting. "What I really am," he said slowly, deliberately, "is a father who wants his daughter to be proud of him. What I really am is someone who knows what rock bottom looks like and climbs out of it every single day. What I really am is a human being who made terrible choices and is spending the rest of his life trying to make up for them." He paused, letting those words sink in before continuing. "But what you are, Joy, is someone who gets paid to tear people down on television. Someone who thinks being mean is the same thing as being smart. Someone who has never had to fight for anything real in your entire life. So you don't understand what real change looks like." Joy opened her mouth to respond, but Jelly Roll held up a hand to stop her. "I'm not done. You want to talk about accountability? Let's talk about your accountability. How many people have you discouraged from getting help by making them think that society will never accept their redemption? How many second chances have you destroyed with your cynicism? How many families have you kept divided by convincing them that people can't really change?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, and Joy's face showed that they had hit their mark. She was no longer the confident attacker she had been at the beginning of the confrontation. Now she looked like someone who was realizing that she might have picked a fight with the wrong person. "You think you're so clever," Jelly Roll continued, his voice filled with disappointment more than anger now. "You think you're exposing some kind of fraud, but all you're doing is showing everyone exactly what kind of person you really are. Someone who would rather tear others down than build anything up yourself." Sarah Haynes tried to jump in with a diplomatic comment, but both Joy and Jelly Roll ignored her completely. This had become something much more personal than a television interview. A battle between two completely different philosophies of life. Two completely different ways of looking at human nature and redemption. "I stand by everything I've said," Joy declared, but her voice was shaky now. People have a right to be skeptical of convenient transformations. Quote. Jelly Roll shook his head slowly, and when he looked at her, there was something that almost looked like sadness in his eyes. You know what the really tragic thing is? You could have used this opportunity to have a real conversation about addiction, about criminal justice reform, about how we help people rebuild their lives. Instead, you chose to be cruel for no reason other than your own entertainment. The weight of that statement seemed to settle over the entire studio like a heavy blanket. For a moment, even Joy appeared to be considering his words, but then her defensive instincts kicked back in, and she straightened up in her chair with renewed defiance. Don't lecture me about entertainment, she snapped. This is journalism. This is asking the tough questions that other people are afraid to ask. If you can't handle scrutiny, maybe you shouldn't be putting yourself in the public eye. Jelly Roll's laugh was bitter and cold. Tough questions? Is that what you call this? Let me ask you some tough questions then. When was the last time you admitted you were wrong about something? When was the last time you showed genuine compassion for someone who made mistakes? When was the last time you used your platform to actually help someone instead of just tearing them down? Joy's mouth opened and closed without any sound coming out. She clearly hadn't expected to become the one being interrogated, and she was struggling to regain her footing in a conversation that had completely gotten away from her. That's what I thought, Jelly Roll continued, his voice gaining momentum again. You can dish it out, but you can't take it. You can attack someone else's character all day long, but the moment someone questions yours, suddenly, that's unfair. Whoopi made another attempt to restore order. Okay, I think we need to. No, Jelly Roll said firmly, turning to address Whoopi directly. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but this needs to be said. I came here in good faith to talk about music and redemption and maybe inspire some people. Instead, I walked into an ambush by someone who decided before I even sat down that I was a fraud. He turned back to Joy, and his voice became quieter but somehow more intense. You know what the saddest part about all this is? You had a chance to be part of something positive today. You could have asked me about the programs I support, about the kids I mentor, about the real work that's being done to help people change their lives. Instead, you chose to be a bully. I am not a bully, Joy protested. For what? Jelly Roll exploded again, his composure finally completely shattered. For getting clean? For turning my life around? For trying to help other people avoid the mistakes I made? What exactly am I being held accountable for here, besides having a past that makes you uncomfortable? The studio was electric with tension. Camera operators were getting shots of audience members with their hands over their mouths, clearly shocked by the intensity of what they were witnessing. In the control room, producers were frantically trying to decide whether this was a disaster or the most compelling television they'd ever captured. You're being held accountable for profiting off a redemption narrative, while real people are still suffering from the consequences of your actions. Joy shot back, finally finding her voice again. Profiting? Jelly Roll's voice cracked with emotion. You think I'm profiting from this? Every dollar I make from my music, every opportunity I get, comes with the weight of knowing that I have to earn it every single day. You think I don't know that there are families out there who lost someone to drugs I sold? You think I sleep easy at night because I have a record deal now? He was leaning over the desk again, his face just inches from Joy's, and when he spoke, his voice was raw with pain. I give away more money than most people make in a year to organizations that help addicts. I spend my free time visiting prisons and talking to kids who remind me of myself at that age. I use every platform I have to tell people that they can change their lives if they're willing to do the work. My platform. My monocation. I won. And onside and two. Joy tried to interrupt, but Jelly Roll's voice overpowered hers completely. But you don't want to hear about any of that, do you? Because it doesn't fit your narrative.